Hello, friends and colleagues. It is 2 o'clock. Welcome back to the Zoom room. My in-laws' dogs are barking in the distance. I apologize if you can hear that. This is the glory of Zoom. All right. Welcome, everyone. We have just a couple minutes that we're going to introduce all of our. Sorry. Mara, will you take it from here so that these dogs don't go crazy?
Oh. Sure. That's all right. Although Kendall, I would be happy to have you as well. I didn't write up all of our official bios that are. I wasn't grabbing those off, and I know Kendall may have already. It's okay with the. I know everyone here and what they do, so I guess I can just speak from that. And we're also we have Samuel Torvin too, who will also be a part of the panel coming in as well. So far we have actually, Kendall, we're going to take a minute while I'm going to pull up information unless you have it already, Kendall, and can just lead us through introductions. So I'm ready to talk, but I'm not ready to do that.
We will trust that we are graceful and present. So I can lead us in. So in our 5 breakout room options that you find folks pre-registered for, we have a variety of wonderful conversations this afternoon. We have what we've been hearing from Dr. Merritt Charleston today, which is a gift. We'll continue to talk about burial, cremation, faith, and ecology. And so, Merritt, thank you for that conversation. Dr. Samuel Torvin is actually unable to join us this afternoon. He got called into the doctor's office, and so everything is okay as far as I know, but he will not be joining us. So for those that have registered for his breakout room, hang out after the breakout rooms have started, and you and I can figure out which session to step into. And then we also have from Luther Seminary, Dr. Beverly Wallace. Welcome. Dr. Wallace will be talking about African American grief. So thank you for being here for this conversation. We also have another PLU faculty member, Dr. Mark Mulder from the School of Business, to talk end of life, what we can do better, research and approach to the end of life. Dr. Mulder, I know a lot of people are excited to engage in that conversation with you. So thank you for being here this afternoon. And finally, we have Satya Jake to talk about life and loss in a time of unknowing, spiritual and mental health perspectives. Satya, this is going to be a near and dear conversation to my heart. So thank you so very much for being here today. It's good. It's good to have all of you here. Can we give just each of us just a 2-minute elevator speech of what the conversation will be, and then we'll go off into our breakout room for about 20 to 30 minutes and have those direct conversations. Merritt, would you be willing to start?
Sure. Thank you, Kendall. I think I might have even been a little more generous and said that people could have 3 to 5 minutes. So I'm not going to hurry you all. I was hoping in there just so that people, since we only can go to 1 or 2 breakout rooms, that you get a little chance to have some time to hear from different people. Kendall, may I have sharing? May I share my screen?
I believe you should be able to right now.
All right. Thank you. In talking about, this morning I was sharing about different things and in the time of COVID, and but here, this is coming from a class I teach in January called Death and the Afterlife, where so maybe the first part of the day was kind of the intuitive, but this is the stuff that I teach and kind of groove on a daily basis of thinking about Christian theology and different understandings of the body and ritual. So what I'll be offering in my group to give everyone a little bit of a background is some models of the afterlife from early Christianity through the Middle Ages into contemporary times, some differences in these theologies, or whether the spirit and body are ever separable or not, whether everything is ultimately redeemed, all of creation, all people universally or not in those models, whether salvation waits for kind of a future time and a future final resurrection, or whether kind of this, or whether it's immediate, and then what the afterlife is like. This ascent to God being a model of joining the being of God, a harmony of all creation, or the idea of heaven where I wrote this in here, it sounds a little snarky, maybe it was late at night, the idea of heaven where we get all the things we ever wanted, like this very consumerist individual idea that actually in the history of Christianity is really recent. This is not a model that was been for 1800 years or so until fairly recent. In early Christianity, just to give you this brief overview, Tertullian, an early Christian theologian, held that actually all souls waited in Hades and until the day of resurrection. So Hades and Sheol, coming out of the Jewish tradition. Origen had this idea that actually the purpose of life and the afterlife is to become increasingly a part of God and to be like theosis, this idea of transformation, divine transformation. Gregory of Nyssa, I had this image of humanity. Why I have these swirls down below there is that there's an everlasting ascent to God, that is what the afterlife is. It is a God-centered understanding of the afterlife rather than a person or subject-centered idea of the afterlife. Your own kind of being who you are was less important. Augustine talked about the resurrection of the dead, and when the earthly material of your body returns to the soul on the day of Christ, kind of in an ultimate day of resurrection. Thomas Aquinas has I love his image of the beatific vision when all of creation and everything is restored kind of to its full created capacity. And when everything is kind of locked into this fullness, there's this harmony that breaks out, kind of like musical overtones that you don't hear until it's like perfectly in line. That's his image of the afterlife, is that you kind of you're brought to fullness, and then you kind of like lock in to the like harmony of everything, and it just kind of sings. Dante is the one who brought all these weird images, frankly, of all these layers of hell, purgatory, and heaven that are so much a part of the Western imagination that they're almost impossible to excise if you're in this idea of like, how far into hell am I? How far into heaven am I? And at the base of hell in his model, it is the devil is a big dragon locked in ice with the betrayers around him. It's pretty bizarre and interesting, but it's cold in hell. It is not hot at the final layer. Luther affirmed the sleep of the dead until the day of Christ. You can see this in images of, there's a play, I believe it's called Our Town, where people are sitting around in chairs on the stage waiting for, they're just joining the dead, and they're all just sitting around talking, and time kind of passes quickly. Karl Rahner, a Roman Catholic theologian, and Friedrich Schleiermacher, who was much earlier, the father of Protestant theology is what he's called, both Rahner argued for this idea that God's plan for all of creation is the eventual restoration and salvation of all. And Friedrich Schleiermacher argued that there had to be universal salvation of all people because of God's love and grace. Others have emphasized the kingdom of God as a reality that comes to earth, when God's justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like an everlasting stream. And this is the kingdom of God, that I'm not waiting for a post-death, but actually that it'll come right here and take place here in righteousness, in justice, in peace. Bodies, in terms of burial and whether they're important. This I'll be talking about home funerals as an option that's talked about in some folks, instead of going to a funeral home or something like that, of actually taking care of the bodies of our loved ones in our homes. I'll be talking about Mark Harris, who writes this book, Grave Matters, who talks about traditional burial and other more ecological burials. And some of these forms of burial, whether they are, and I wrote there in terms of their ecological impact, they are numbered from highest to lowest. Wait, that's confusing. Memorial reefs, number one being the worst. Okay, so in terms of ecological impact, burial at sea, cremation, natural burials, natural organic reduction, which is the new, you might have heard of, like human composting, and then also natural burials. So Washington State is one of the first states to actually make it legal to compost human bodies and return the bodies to their loved ones as soil to be put into their backyard. We'll talk a bit about standard burial and natural burial or green burial. And these decisions about burial, just saying one's theology these decisions about burial might depend on one's theology, an idea of what heaven's like, whether we remain as individuals, merge with God, the importance of the body, resurrection of the body or spirit heaven, location and time of kingdom of God, whether it's this world that's ultimately renewed or a separate heaven, whether again it's a day of resurrection or immediately, and then ecological concerns that I've already mentioned. So that's just a little rundown.
Great, thank you, Merritt. Appreciate it. Reverend Dr. Wallace, for my other alma mater, would you be willing to give a short intro into your conversation this afternoon?
Sure, and I think I can do it in 3 minutes, Merritt. Okay, and let me see if I can find my PowerPoint. Yes, right here. Okay, I'm going to share just an introduction. I am Dr. Beverly Wallace. I am professor of congregation and community care at Luther Seminary. Interestingly enough, Merritt, I didn't know we had that much in common. My dissertation was on end-of-life care in the African-American community, and I've written, co-authored on African-American grief, and I'm guessing that's the reason why you invited me to present here. If you look on the one side, the black and white, that book came out in 2005, and then it was republished with a legendary or classic series through Routledge Press this year, where in this is, we have a new forward to it, but basically the body of it is interviews that I did with persons about their grief experience. About 21 persons, African-American persons around the country, about how they understood grief and loss. I myself, interestingly enough, 2005 was the year that my husband passed away, but it was also the year that this book came out. I have been doing some work. I've been a former chaplain, and so have some interest in grief and loss. And for the last 7 years, I've been living my dissertation in the care of my mom and my brother and my father. Earlier you talked about rituals. Well, my ritual, I decided, was that I was going to move back to Atlanta. And so the background here is me redoing my basement. And so that's part of the ritual of my healing. Earlier this year, I was a part of a panel with the Hospice Foundation of America, looking at complicated grief, living with grief since COVID-19. There's a new publication that came out. I have a piece in that on African-American grief. And so why African-American grief? And this is going to be the essence of my presentation or the workshop, because I like to talk, so we're going to have conversation. One of the things I say is that African-American grief is like every other grief, and it is like no other grief. And so to get into the nuances of cultural grief is important. Talk about the importance of grief because we've lost someone. We've lost something that is of importance, something that we've loved. Going to the next one. And I'm going to be talking about soul trauma and the impact of the soul and what happens to the soul. No, I'm not going to get into that. That's Merritt's work as far as addressing what happens to the soul. But what I will say is that soul trauma, particularly in the African American community, is when the prevailing societal forces interrupt, diminish, or destroy the soul of an individual or harm the soul of an individual or a people. And for the African American community, it was the Ma'afa, the great tragedy of the transatlantic slave syndrome. So I'm going to touch on that a bit too. So in answer to the question that was raised by this conference, how do we embrace mortality and approach death and grief with intentionality? And so I'm going to suggest several ways to do that. The first one, it's looking at the tragic vision. And I'm going to unpack that a little bit. I wrote an article about the tragic vision with the colon, it will be all right. During the midst of the pandemic, there's a tragic vision looking at the abyss. What happens when you finally face death, talk about death and loss. In the African American community, we've always had to look at our mortality. And what I'm saying, even in the midst of this pandemic, it's going to be all right. Secondly, I'm going to use an example from the Order of the Sisters of the Good Death and how they understand grief and loss. This is a Catholic order in Brazil that understands that death means freedom. And then living with the ambiguity. Again, African Americans have always lived with ambiguity. And so if we can be intentional about addressing death and grief and loss, perhaps not only African Americans, but all of us can live with ambiguity, understand what does that mean. And then finally, I think, particularly as it relates to the African American community or other communities, how do you understand and the significance of grief from a cultural perspective? What I'm saying is that African Americans have always, life has always been cut short. And so that's why it's difficult to address death and grief and loss. There's stressors within our community and it impacts our body. And so I'm going to touch a little bit on telomeres. And then I'm saying that one of the difficulties is that we don't want to talk about history and the cultural realities of folk or the accumulation of grief and the implications for addressing death. Finally, I want to say this work in this conference is important. I'm glad that you're doing this. I'm glad that we're having this opportunity to talk. And then I hope some of you will join me in the workshop. That's it.
Thank you, Dr. Wallace. Wonderful.
Welcome.
Looking forward to that.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Mark Mulder from PLU Business Office, the Dean of the Business Office, in fact. I missed that key word earlier. Mark, would you like to say some words about your conversation this afternoon?
Sure. Well, in the buffet of options for you to choose from, what I'm going to be talking about today is not the death process itself or what happens after death, but what happens before. And this is the end of life journey. And so I'm not going to have any slides to share right now. I'll share them in our presentation, but that's how my presentation will differ from the two that you've just heard. And so thinking about end of life, what is it? What is a good end of life? At PLU, we asked the students the question, what do you want to do with your one wild and precious life, from the Mary Oliver quote and poem? And I would reframe that to be, what do you want to do with your one wild and precious end of life? And put the key word on life rather than death and what precedes death. And while death is present and it is the ultimate culmination of that process, it can be decoupled from that process and to be meaningful. So what I will be presenting are some personal experiences and journey, as well as some research, and thinking about it from a faith and a church perspective. So how could the church really be a connector and a convener about what a good end of life might look like? we know, I'm a trained behaviorist and I focus on consumer decision-making and psychology. We know that our mortality is something we don't like to confront. Even the thought of mortality creates an anxiety and a fear. And our response is not to confront that fear, but to flee from it typically. And so that's one of the reasons why we have a stigma around end of life, and we don't allow it to be meaningful and fulfilling. In a lot of cases, we only experience it as it comes to be rather than to really prepare for it. So this is thinking about how could the church be a convener? What are some tools that the church can consider? What are some personas that arise as people are going through their own end of life journey? And how can the church walk alongside to not only support, but also prepare, and to prepare far in advance, potentially even before death confronts us through terminal illness? And so wouldn't it be beautiful if we imagined what a good end of life might look like? And if you say that, yes, that would be beautiful, the question then becomes, how do we facilitate it? And as a church community, how do we convene conversations around that? So we're going to talk a little bit about some research and some tools that will help the church play that role of convener and a preparation in something that is going to be meaningful. And it's been said that no one escapes life without death. And so we know it's coming. Let's make it beautiful. Let's own it. And let's think about the process before death in the true end of life. So that's what we'll be talking about in our session.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Really appreciate that. Satya, do you want to share some thoughts about your conversation this afternoon as well? Oh, it looks like you are muted. Just a second. Let's restart. There we go.
Okay. First of all, hello, everybody. I'd like to thank Dr. Trelstad for coordinating this conference today. And my reaction and impression is that there's just so much richness here. There's so little time to really delve into the richness of all these conversations. I'm going to describe what I'm going to do by telling a story. A few years ago, I was on a plane flying to visit my family on the East Coast, and we were somewhere over the Midwest when the pilot came on the loudspeaker and announced that there was a large thunderstorm ahead and that we would try to skirt the edges of it. It was one of those summer thunderstorms that stretches for many miles, so we couldn't entirely avoid it. The pilot ordered the flight crew to be seated, always a sure sign that the going was going to get rough. A few minutes later, we flew into a huge cloud system, and then the turbulence began. Now, I should tell you that I always reserve a window seat because I enjoy looking out the window of the airplane and tracking where we are. I've also noticed that it somehow helps me to be able to see the ground. If I'm seated near the engine, tucked under the wing, I even occasionally check to make sure it's not on fire. So we were flying through the clouds. There was nothing to see, up, down, or sidewards, just nothing. And then it got really bumpy, and the cabin got really quiet. I felt the plane lurch, and even try to ascend a little bit to avoid the worst of it. But no matter what the pilot did, we were in for a turbulent ride. And it went on and on for over 30 minutes. I know this because I looked at my watch every few minutes, alternating between deep breathing, prayer, and the mantra, planes don't drop out of the sky from turbulence, which I'm not sure I even believe. I was really scared. To everyone's relief, we finally flew out of it, but it was a harrowing 40 minutes from beginning to end. I think about this experience whenever we enter a time of unknowing in our lives. This could look like the wait for medical tests to come back. It could look like the death of a spouse of many years, with no idea of what life looks like without them. It could look like being laid off from a job that was fulfilling. It could look like having a loved one in the military deployed to a country at war. And it could look like the past year and a half of the COVID pandemic. Or collectively as a nation, we can be thrust into a time of unknowing by political and religious extremism, racial violence, loss of trust in our leaders and institutions, and uncertainty about the future of our planet due to climate change. In terms of living in a time of unknowing, the big question is, Who or what can we hold on to when we're in free fall, when the plane feels like it will fall out of the sky? In my counseling practice, I've seen more clients for anxiety over the last year and a half than in my entire career as a therapist. In fact, this morning I was talking with a teacher from PLU who said that most of her students were feeling highly anxious and that some had even been diagnosed with anxiety disorders and taking medication. In this breakout session, we'll be exploring two different types of anxiety, general anxiety and existential anxiety, and the growth that can come from leaning into times of unknowing with an open heart. We'll look at the role that spirituality plays in helping to mitigate anxiety and what we can learn from marginalized communities when it comes to resilience and hope.